Good evening, everyone. This is Emily Lochner. I hope that you all have had a great week so far. I'm going to ask and see Billy Hall. I do believe, hopefully you're on. Billy Hall with Chapel Feeders is going to start out real quick and give you guys a quick update on something that has happened at the yard in the last month. Billy, are you there?
Are you asking for Linda? What do you think?
Well, hopefully Billy will come on here in just a moment, and we can give you an update. But tonight, we have a great guest with us. Doug Hufstedler of Elanco Animal Health is going to talk to you guys a little bit about implants, feed additives, modern technologies that happen in the feed yard. And so until Billy is able to get on, hopefully soon, Doug, I'll just turn it over to you if you want to get started, and then maybe we'll get Billy on here at the end.
Okay, I'm going to switch to full screen mode. So we should be able to, can I minimize this? I believe I can. There we go. Can everyone still see my screen? Or Emily, can you see my screen?
I sure can.
Okay, so what we'll do tonight, we'll spend probably 30 minutes going through some information on some technologies that hopefully you've been learning about, or we'll go over some of those tonight. And these would be technologies that are utilized by the feed yard system in the beef industry. And some of them are actually used in the cow-calf sector, and then in the stocker phase, and then as we move into the feedlot phase, which makes the beef industry a little bit unique compared to poultry or swine, in that we do have three distinct sectors of our industry that cattle move from one to the other. Sometimes they skip a step and go straight from the cow-calf operation. The calves are weaned and go as calf fed straight to a feed yard. But generally the calves are born, and then they're weaned off their moms, and then they go into a growing situation, generally on pasture, because that's more economically friendly. And then after we put about 200 more pounds on them and they hit about 700 pounds, that's when they transition into the feed yard. And so we're going to talk about tonight some technologies that the beef cattle industry uses to help improve efficiency in those animals. And a lot of you probably heard the term sustainability. And so these technologies go hand in hand with sustainability of agriculture and what we're doing, and we'll go through those. So the four technologies that I want you to remember tonight, if you want to jot these down, would be Rumensin is one product, Talon is another, that are commonly used in the feed yard industry, and then we're going to talk about implants. And then we'll end up with a very brief discussion on Optiflex, which is a different type of product, and we'll go through all of those products. We won't touch on Talon too much, but I'll let you know what it does. But primarily Rumensin, implants, and Optiflex for tonight's discussion. And when we think about these technologies, when we think about these technologies and sustainability, these technologies allow us to produce beef much more efficiently when we employ these technologies, and they all have different modes of action, and so they can all be used together to increase our ability to efficiently produce beef in the United States. And when you think about this, sustainability, if we didn't use these technologies, we would need 10 million more head of cattle to feed the U.S. population than we have now, and we really don't have that kind of space. It would take 81 million more tons of feed to feed these cattle, and with all of these extra cattle, we would actually produce 18 million more metric tons of CO2, which that's the equivalent of 3 million more cars on the highway if we don't utilize these technologies, because what these technologies do is they allow the metabolic features of the ruminant animal to be able to produce protein more efficiently and create less waste. So we use less feed, less water, less fertilizer, and pesticides to grow the feed, and they actually produce less CO2 when we utilize these technologies in the feed yard system. And so the first one that we'll talk about is Rumensin, and actually Rumensin is Elanco developed Rumensin discovered it back in the 1950s and 60s. And actually it's a soil-borne bacteria that Elanco grows, and then we harvest the molecule Rumensin off of this bacteria that we grow after we feed it for about 28 days in a fermentation vat. And these fermentation vats, if you think about tanker rail cars that are going down the railroad track, that's about the size of these fermentation vats that we have at our plant up in Clinton, Indiana. And all of you are probably familiar with a semen straw. When you're AIing your heifers, the semen in that straw that comes from a bull, and that's the size of the bacteria. We use a straw of bacteria from this original strain that we collected back in there from Arizona, and that grows into a full-size tanker car because of how we feed it and the conditions that we keep it under within about 28 days. And so you can just imagine how rapidly that bacteria grows. And then we harvest this byproduct, Rumensin, which this bacteria creates off of those rail car size tankers at the factory. And so that's basically what Rumensin is. And you may hear the term ionophore as you go through your education, but that's something that it can permeate a membrane, and we'll talk about why that's important. And it's classified as an antibiotic by the FDA, but it's not like an antibiotic that you use to treat a sickness in an animal. It's a different class of antibiotics that aren't used in human medicine. And so this is an antibiotic that changes the bacteria that are in the rumen of the beef cow. And so one of the most important things that it does, and why it was discovered originally to be beneficial to cattle, is that some of you may be familiar with coccidiosis, and if you're not, you can talk to your advisor or talk to your veterinarian. But coccidiosis can be a really detrimental disease in the beef industry, and it's very prevalent because the spores stay active in the soil, and we can't get rid of them. And so cattle are very susceptible to it, and what it does is it damages the intestine, and in these 3 different stages, these gametes break out of the cysts that they form inside the small intestine, and then that damages the villi of the small intestine, and it can actually cause bleeding or bloody diarrhea if the situation is bad enough. But even if you don't have bloody diarrhea in your calves, if it's there, it's going to damage the small intestines, and that makes your cattle less efficient. And so Rumensin is very effective at stopping this disease because it kills these gametes that break through in all 3 of these stages. And the really nice thing about Rumensin is there are other products that you may have heard of that also work on coccidiosis, but if you look at Rumensin on the top line there, if you look on the far right-hand side, it requires a very low dose to be very effective and actually kill the cocci organism in all 3 of those stages. And that's what cidal means, is it actually kills the organism. And so don't worry about all the detail of this slide, but just look at the mortality line, which is the gray line, about halfway down. Mortality means death, percent death of cattle that were infected with coccidiosis. And you can see that if you include Rumensin in their diet, if the cattle didn't have any Rumensin, that first column, we had a 16% death loss. But then a very low level of Rumensin at 32 milligrams up to 104 milligrams, all of those doses are very low doses actually, and are lower than what we typically use in the feed yard. And you can see that there were 0 death loss. And then if you look at the bottom line, the average daily gain, you obviously see the effect of the average daily gain is that it increases because it's preventing that damage in the intestinal wall that coccidiosis can cause. Now we'll switch to the other effect that Rumensin has, is that it doesn't matter whether the cattle are grazing forages out on grass, whether it's a mama cow and nursing her calf, whether it's a stalker calf grazing wheat pasture, or whether it's actually in the feed yard and it's eating a high grain diet as it's getting ready to be harvested at the end of the feedlot phase. Doesn't matter what the diet type is that Rumensin changes the bacterial population in the rumen and generates more of the fuel. A lot of you are familiar with glucose and how if you've taken biology in high school, that glucose is the fuel that humans run on. Well, cattle are different, and cattle run on what we call VFAs, and that's the column out there. And the most efficient VFA for the cattle to produce is propionic acid. And so that's what Rumensin does, is it actually kills off some of the bacteria in the rumen that are less efficient and in favor of bacteria that produce more propionic acid. And so we actually get more energy generated from this propionic acid. And if you think about it, we get about 12% more energy out of whatever diet the cattle are consuming when you include Rumensin in the diet. And that's why not only do cow-calf operators use it in the cow herd, but also stalker operators use it, and then obviously feed yards use it. And we'll talk about some of the advantages that each of those sectors get when they include Rumensin in the diet. If we look at a stalker calf that's grazing, an easy thing for you to remember is that when you include Rumensin in the diet, and generally it's about 200 milligrams, is that you're going to improve your average daily gain. Now, I know a lot of you are probably keeping your records on your calves that you have in the program, but you're going to increase the average daily gain of that calf by 0.2 of a pound per day. So whatever gain you're getting right now that you're inserting into your record books, if you add Rumensin to the diet of those calves, you're going to bump that average daily gain by another 0.2 of a pound. And so it's an easy thing to remember, because you can feed Rumensin for about 2 cents per head per day, and I'm going to get 0.2 of a pound extra average daily gain when I do that in an animal. When we talk about a feedlot animal, it changes a little bit. In a feedlot steer, we get about a 4% improvement in feed efficiency. So what that means is I'm going to be able to take a steer all the way out to harvest, and I'm going to be able to do that on 4% less feed throughout that program. And really that comes down to a savings about, in a feed yard, it's about $23 a head, for $23 to $25 a head, depending on what ration cost is. So when you think about a feed yard that has anywhere from 20 to 100,000 head in that feed yard, that's a huge saving for those operations, and that's why they utilize Rumensin in those programs. One thing else to think about is that Rumensin is in my opinion, is probably one of the better ionophores on the market, because not only can we use less of it to completely control coccidiosis, but if you're feeding it in a mineral program, if you have your cattle out on grass, then you're actually going to get higher gains than other programs that are out there. And this just shows you that if you just feed white salt, you're getting minimal gains by just feeding white salt. The gray bar is if I feed a more balanced mineral, and then the orange bar is if I feed that same mineral that includes Rumensin in it. That's the additional gain that I got on these wheat pasture cattle in Oklahoma. And we get that year in and year out. And then the blue bar is another ionophore that's produced by another company. And so it's a very effective product on the market for you to utilize. And probably if you think about the feedlot industry for you guys, I believe the last time we calculated it, about 95% of the cattle on feed in the United States are fed Rumensin. And that's because of that 4% improvement in feed efficiency that we get in the feed yard. And so it's a very important technology in the feedlot industry. The next one that's really important is implants. And a lot of you may have, you hear a lot of bad things about, hormones in this and hormones in that. And, I don't want to be feeding my kids hormones. And you think about BST. If you go to Brahms and you buy milk out of the thing, it says, well, these cows were not fed BST. And that's a hormone that is used to help milk cows produce more milk, about 10 pounds more milk per day. But really, the hormones have gotten a really bad rap because there's no difference. If you measured milk from a cow that was given BST and milk from a cow that's not, you couldn't tell the difference in the hormone level in the milk because there's hormones that are secreted naturally by those cows. And so, unfortunately, it's mainly a marketing ploy that has generated some of this anti-hormone usage. But they're a critical, as far as sustainability goes for our industry, they're a critical part of that in that they help us produce more pounds on less water and feed, thus requiring less fertilizer and use of resources that are out there. And we can produce more meat with fewer animals than we have in the past. And so that's very crucial to our industry. As we think about urban sprawl and cities getting bigger and bigger and the actual arable landmass where we can actually grow agricultural products and the water that we need to do that is actually shrinking, being able to produce the same amount of meat from a beef cow with less feed and less water and less inputs is crucial for the sustainability of our industry. So here's just a little hormone fact that many people are unaware of, is that we're all secreting hormones in our system every day, and this just gives you some perspective on how much children secrete, how much if someone was taking birth control, how many nanograms per day they would be receiving. An adult man, an adult woman, how many nanograms per day that we produce naturally from our own hormonal systems that help us regulate what we do in our metabolism and our growth and all of those types of things. The levels that we implant cattle with are very small, but that very small difference, I'll show you what it can do when we increase that hormone level just by a very small amount. But when you look at the estrogen level in food under the dinner plate there, if you look at a 3-ounce serving from a non-implanted steer, there's 1.2 nanograms in it of estrogen. If you look at a 3-ounce serving from an implanted steer, there's 1.9 nanograms. That's barely a detectable difference and is definitely not a significant difference. And these hormones have even BST and these hormones that we use in cattle have been proven safe. They're probably the most researched molecules in the food industry as far as their safety goes, and they've always been proven to be safe. And so you have to keep in mind and put this in perspective is that other foods also have naturally occurring estrogens in them. And so that's why these other food products are on the same table. You can look at potatoes or peas or cabbage. all of those have significantly greater estrogen levels than meat from a 3-ounce steak of a steer that's been implanted. And especially if you look at the last one there on the bottom right, you know, a lot of people that protest against using hormones also love to get their soy milk latte at their favorite Starbucks. And soy milk is one of the highest levels of estrogen that you can find. And a 3-ounce soy milk latte has 11 million nanograms of estrogen in it. And so we need to have a balance and put a perspective on what levels of these things are in food. But the reason we use it in the beef cattle industry is that very minute increase that we do when we put an implant in their ear, and I'll show you where that goes in just a second, is that it increases their dry matter intake, which that helps them consume more food, which that goes into a nutrient pool that then is going into the muscle, the growth of the muscle cell itself, and the fat cells as well. But then also, through another mechanism, these implants, it increases the amount of protein synthesis, or the growth of that protein of that muscle cell. And so these muscle cells get bigger when you implant an animal. And so we're producing more muscle in relation to fat, and muscle is more efficient to produce than fat. And so that's why we use these technologies in the beef industry, and that's where we get this added gain and more meat per pound of animal than we did back in the 60s and 70s because of these technologies that we can take advantage of. Now, don't let this slide scare you, but these are all of the implants out there. And I want to divide it into two segments, in that about the first quarter of this graph to the left, those are implants that we would use in calves and in grazing systems. And so a TEG is a grazing system implant. EC is an implant that you would put in a calf. A Rowgrow is a common implant that you would put in a suckling calf. And then when you get to ES, the big gray bar in the middle, that's kind of the dividing line. And then everything to the right of that, those are implants that we would utilize in a feed yard. And because we want to, and depending on how long the animal is going to be in the feed yard and how many days, you know, we would use nutritionist will help set the program up for the feed yard of, okay, I want you to use this implant in the first, these lower blue bars when the animal arrives, and then about 70 to 100 days from harvest, they're going to put another implant in there to maintain that efficiency, and it would be more towards the far right-hand side. It's a stronger implant that then helps the animal maintain its efficiency. You can see there's different colors in there, but the blue bar is what we call an androgen. It's a synthetic androgen, a male hormone, and then the pink bars. The pink bar is an estrogen, and that's the level of estrogen that we would put in there. And so those are a female hormone. And then the reason that we put the two together is that research done over the years, we find that when we combine this particular ratio of male and female hormone together, that's where we got the best effect, and the cattle were the most efficient when we had this particular ratio of male to female hormones, and we produce the best carcasses when we include that combination or that ratio of those different hormones in there. And so that's kind of a busy slide, but that's what your feed yards would be using, would be more to the right-hand side of that graph, would be implants that would be common to the feedlot system. Now this is a summary of the benefits that our industry, the beef industry, gets when we implant these animals. And so you can see the improvement in average daily gain, but just look at the weights. A suckling steer calf that's implanted is going to be 18 pounds heavier. Then if we implant the stalker calf, he's going to put on 33 more pounds. And then the feedlot steer is going to put on about 75 pounds, sometimes even 100 pounds, depending on how aggressive the implant program is that that the nutritionist has the feedlot use. So in general, we get about 126 additional pounds off of an animal by utilizing this technology, and those extra pounds generate value to the feed yard or to the different production phases, because a cow-calf operator, he's selling calves, and the heavier those calves are, he's paid on pounds of body weight. So the heavier those calves are, the greater value that those calves are going to bring that cow-calf. The same for the stocker operator. The heavier those calves are, the additional weight that he's putting on, he's going to be able to generate more income for that particular operation. And for a calf implant and a steer implant, they're probably around $1 or $1.25 per calf. Some of the feedlot implants get up in the $2, $3, $5 range, but you can see if I'm only spending $1, $1.25 for this steer or this calf or steer stocker implant, look at the return I'm getting. That implants have the greatest return on investment of any technology that we utilize in the beef industry, and that's why they're so important to our industry. And not only do they function independently of each other and have different modes of action, but because they do have different modes of action, Rumensin working on the bacteria in the gut and generating more energy from whatever the calf is consuming, and then the implant is acting on the intake of the animal and also the muscle cells themselves and causing them to get bigger at a faster rate. Then these two things are additive. And so when I and this happens to be grazing cattle data, but the same thing applies to the feed yard, is that when I add Rumensin, I'm going to get 20 pounds, basically 20 pounds in general. Sometimes we get a lot more, 31 pounds here, by adding Rumensin to the diet, the supplement program of these grazing animals. And then if I add a grazing steer implant, which is what TEG is, then I'm going to pick up another 20 to 40 pounds of weight. And so basically I'm generating around probably an average, if you look at all of these numbers, probably an additional 50 pounds per calf by utilizing Rumensin and an implant technology together. And this just means how significant it is. And so it's when we add these technologies together, they're highly significant. And that same concept translates to the feed yard system as well. And in fact, these numbers, because you feed an animal in the feed yard longer and you use 2 implants generally versus 1, these numbers are going to be about, these implant numbers will double at least and may get a little bit greater. But then what we look at in a feed yard is different than a grazing animal. Just remember that 4% improvement in feed efficiency. And in a feedlot, they're going to feed 200 plus days. And so that's where we pick up the advantage with Rumensin in a feed yard. And then we're going to double this number of pounds from the implants that we use in a feed yard system. An important thing to realize is that if any of you have, I don't know how many of you have implanted calves before, but this is our implant gun, and you can see that there's a stainless steel needle here, and this is a cartridge where the implants will slide in a plastic cartridge. It contains 20 implants right here, but I just wanted to show you that. And then if you think about it, when we insert this needle into the back side of the ear, about midway down the ear, anytime we insert a needle like that, we're going to, whatever's on the outside of this ear can have manure, can have bacteria. Hopefully you sanitize that and wipe it off, and we obviously recommend that you use some Novosan on a brush to brush that ear off and get it as clean as possible. But there's no way we can remove all the soil and the bacteria that may be present there. And so what Elanco has done is that our implants have the first implant in our implants is a Tylen pellet. And that ptyalin is a localized antibacterial. And so ptyalin, this pellet is very hygroscopic, and so it dissolves very rapidly once you place it inside the channel that you've created with the needle, this warm, moist environment of where you've placed these implants on the back side of the ear, and this is the cartilage in the ear. It dissolves very rapidly, and then it's going to coat that channel where those implants are, and basically coat all of those pellets that contain the hormone inside those pellets. And then this is what we're trying to prevent, is that this is a healthy implant site because you can see there's no swelling, there's no abscess forming around this. This is one of the implant capsules right there, and so you can see this is what we would consider a healthy implant site, and this is what we call a implant abscess. And so anytime we're driving bacteria or soil or any kind of foreign material inside this incision that the needle makes on the back side of that ear, if there's not the ptyalin antibiotic there that dissolves very rapidly, then there's a chance that you're going to get this abscess formation. And abscesses are designed to wall off and prevent the body absorbing and that getting into the bloodstream of the animal, which could cause all kinds of problems or septic type conditions. And so it's just a natural process. It normally doesn't get that bad, but this is just a natural healing immune process and preventative process that the cattle have, that they wall off this bacteria that may be present here, because the immune system has detected the presence of bacteria, and so it walls this off with an abscess so that that bacteria doesn't get into the bloodstream, that you can see the little blood vessels right here. And so it's walling that off, and anytime we do that, that implant is not going to function like it should, and it's not going to be absorbed into the bloodstream like it should, and therefore we're not going to get the growth that we would normally expect out of those animals. And so that's why we put the ptyalin pellet in our implant line, and all of the Elanco implants would have that function on there. And then the last technology that I'm going to talk about is Optiflex. And so we've talked quite a bit about Rumensin and implants, and our Elanco's are a component with ptyalin. That would be the brand name. And then you may have heard of Optiflex. And Optiflex is again a different molecule, a different mode of action, and it's like Rumensin. It can be placed in the feed of the animals that are on feed. But when we use Optiflex, it's only approved for the last, if you look down at the bottom of the scale of the graph here, it can only be fed the last 28 to 42 days of the feeding period. So if I have a target harvest date, I'm going to back calculate either 42 or 28 days from that date, and that's when I'm going to put Optiflex into the feed of those cattle. And so what happens is that a normal animal growth curve, as the animal gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it's going to start putting on more and more fat and less protein. And what happens with Optiflex is Optiflex changes that curve, and it keeps the animal from putting on more fat here at these last 28 to 42 days. And so I'm making the animal more efficient because, again, it acts on the muscle cell and causes this muscle cell to, instead of putting on more fat because I'm getting near my harvest point, my harvest end point, which they're naturally metabolically going to start laying down more fat and more finish. But as they get there, they become, the more fat they lay down, the more inefficient they're becoming. And so when we add Optiflex to the diet, that changes the metabolic curve and keeps those animals, keeps them in a state where they're still producing more protein and more protein synthesis occurring and less fat, less fat deposition onto the carcass. And so we can do that without negatively impacting meat quality or carcass quality, but yet we're going to get a carcass that is a little bit bigger and has greater cutability and greater red meat yield than we do when we don't feed animals Optiflex there at the end of the harvest period. And so this green bar is the net return for a feed yard operator, is when they include, the red bar is the cost of Optiflex. So you can see if I keep feeding it longer and longer and longer, it becomes economically unfeasible, because here's where the net return is this green bar. And so the net return, if we look at all of our data, if we feed Optiflex for about 32 to 33 days, right in here, that's the apex of this curve. And so that's the most efficient time. That's the optimal time to number of days to feed animals Optiflex, is that 31 to 33 days, because I'm on the top side of that curve. And then basically that's going to generate greater than $25 a head additional income for the feed yard, and so that's why they utilize that technology at the end of the feeding period. And so those are the three probably the greatest used technologies in the feedlot industry: Rumensin, Implants, and Optiflex. And so, like I said earlier, they all have different modes of action. And so when you combine their effects, that's why we use all of them in the beef industry at some point. Rumensin's fed throughout the feeding period, and generally the implant is dissolved slowly over time, and so it's there throughout the feeding period. And then finally Optiflex is just fed that last 28 to 42 days. And so by utilizing all of those technologies, we are improving the red meat yield and efficiency of the beef cattle that we're producing without negatively impacting consumer experience with the beef or the quality grade or carcass grades. And so we're doing that, and ultimately we're improving the sustainability of our industry, because when we utilize these technologies, we can produce this high quality red meat with less inputs as far as feed, water, fertilizer, and all that it takes to grow the feed for these animals. And we can do that with fewer and fewer head than we did back in the 60s and 70s. And so that's why these technologies are critical for our industry. And so I've taken up enough of time with telling you about these things, and so generally the most important thing is for you to ask questions, and I'd love to at this time entertain any questions that you have about these technologies or why we use them.
Okay, Doug, I've got a question coming from Minnesota. You mentioned your chart on how much estrogen and hormones is on in a steak versus how much the body naturally produces. You said there's 22 times more estrogen in soy milk than a woman produces daily. Just want to confirm that's correct, and if you wouldn't mind expanding on that a little more.
Yeah, we, a man or a woman, we all produce hormones. I think we've forgotten our biology in biology class, and maybe you didn't cover hormones in your biology class, but certainly universities should cover it in their biology classes. And I think we've just forgotten the fact that we all produce hormones. None of us can live, no animal can live without producing hormones, and that's how we regulate our systems. That's how we regulate our metabolism. That's how we regulate our growth, and we produce incredible amounts every day, whether you're a child, whether you're a man, or whether you're a woman, and so to think that a very small increase in a steak that's been produced from a steer that was implanted, we can't even barely measure that difference between an implanted steer and a non-implanted steer. And so that is in no way going to impact the health or the quality or the safety of that product. And so you should never worry about whether these products are safe or whether whether consuming these products is safe. We have plenty of information, and we actually have that particular set of information is on some little cards that we provide to producers, to veterinarians, and we can certainly get them for your association. That it makes for a good discussion, because most people don't realize that. I mean, there's not a label on your soy latte that says, "Watch out, there's 11 million nanograms in what you're about to drink here." And so it's more about marketing, really, and just lack of education of the public and what's really in their food. And so as an industry, as members of our industry, if we can help them understand that fact and put that in balance, then I think it helps them to understand, well, these things are not dangerous. These things have been heavily investigated over multiple decades, and they've been proven as some of the safest technologies that we use to grow, that we use in animal agriculture and in our food supply, whether that's BST in milk or growth promoting hormones in beef cattle. And so they're very safe, and you should not have any doubts about using them in your program. In some ways, some people have felt that even cattle producers, they felt like, well, I get a better premium for my cattle at the sale barn or even on the Superior Livestock Auction if I don't implant my cattle. There's several data sets from Kansas State, Oklahoma State, and others have looked at the Superior auction data over the last 5 years, and there's actually, for a while there was a premium being paid for non-implanted cattle, but as we progress over the years, that's become less and less popular, and in the last 5 years there hasn't been a significant premium paid for non-implanted cattle going through that auction system. And so what you have to realize as a producer, as somebody in the beef industry growing these animals, is that, well, I'm not being paid a premium for not doing it, so why am I going to give up the 25 to 50 to 75 pounds of extra body weight, which is actually income for me in my operation, by not doing it? And so just that's something all producers need to keep in the back of their mind, is if you're going into a natural program, then you need to make sure they're paying you a premium for the pounds that you're going to give up by not using these technologies. I'm not against these programs, but I do demand that these programs pay the premium that these producers are giving up by not utilizing these technologies.
Awesome, and that's funny you mentioned that. Last week we just heard from Superior, so it's very relevant there. Okay, next question coming from Kansas. What is the effect of implanting breeding heifers or bulls?
So we would never implant a bull calf. If you're going to leave a bull calf intact, and you want to keep him and retain him as a replacement or use him as a bull in the breeding herd, you would never implant that animal. That can interfere with their natural development process. Plus, God's given him two of the best implants in the world, because the testicles, that's what's generating the androgen that turns him into a bull. And so those are a lot bigger and badder than any implant we could give them synthetically. And so intact males don't need a implant, and we wouldn't recommend doing that. You wouldn't. It'd probably more detrimental developmentally than any increase in gain that you're going to get. I personally, it all depends on heifers, on whether you plan to keep those. If you're a purebred herd, which obviously your association is, I would not implant heifers that I intend to sell as replacement heifers. Now, you can do it if they're about 45 to 60 days, at least 45 to 60 days old. You can give a calf an EC implant or a Rowgrow implant, and you're not going to have any significant detrimental effect. But I just their first time conception rates will drop about 5% if they've been implanted, and so I just don't recommend doing it. If I know that they're going to be replacement heifers, or I'm going to sell them as replacement heifers, I don't want that coming back on my reputation of my calves. Now, if I'm definitely going to move those calves, late-born heifer calves that are probably from mama cows that did not breed early and didn't actually get bred in that 60-day window that we try to target, and so they're late. They're probably going to be late throughout their lifetime, even as a heifer, and so and those are generally heifers that we're going to cull out of a herd anyway. And so if I know that those heifers are going to go into a commercial system or going into a stocker program and then ultimately into the food chain through the feedlot system, then I would definitely implant those heifers. If I'm grazing heifers on wheat that I know are going to to a feedlot, I'm definitely going to put a TEG implant in them. And that's something I didn't mention is the TEG implant. The nice thing about that on grazing animals is that you can use that on steers and heifers because of its low dose and the balance of the hormone there. And so I only have to have one implant for both steers and heifers, where when you get into the feedlot phase, they're sex specific based on the ratio of hormones. And so that changes once you get to the feedlot phase. Also, EC, the calf implant for suckling calves, you can use it on steer calves or heifer calves. And in heifer calves, if you're not going to keep them for replacement heifers. So.
Okay, next question from Missouri. Is Optiflex fed for 1 day or 30 to 33 days? Just can you explain what the Optiflex feed rate is?
Okay, it's fed for a minimum of 28 days and a maximum of 42 days before harvest. And so most feed yards have a projected harvest date that as they monitor, based on the calf's weight as they come in and the break-even projections that they do. And so they have a projected slaughter date, and so they're monitoring that date, and then they back calculate. And like I said, most of the industry is feeding around 30 to 33 days before harvest. That's how many days that the cattle are fed Optiflex, because that's the highest rate. That's the highest rate of return on the product.
Awesome. Okay, next question. With the world population growing at the rapid rate that it is, do you think there will be a time in the near future when implanting is a normal practice?
When implanting is what? Could you say that last part again?
I'm sorry, where implanting is just a normal practice?
Well, I would say it's currently a normal practice in the United States and in other countries except the EU. The European Union obviously bans, you can't use in calves in the European Union. And so, but in the United States, in the feedlot sector, I would say it's common practice. You probably have 5 to 7% of the feedlot industry the population of cattle in the feedlots would not receive an implant, and that's because those cattle are going into a natural, some kind of a specialty natural program where they're not implanted. When we go to the stalker phase and the cow-calf phase, again, I agree with you. There are less implants used in those sectors of our business. Probably only about 50% of producers utilize implant technologies when you go into those sectors. Again, I think it's a function of size and capability of the producer and whether they have the equipment where they can. It's easy to put a calf implant in, but a lot of people just don't do it because depending on how you work your calves. A stalker system, our large stalker customers that are almost as big as some feed yards, they're going to run anywhere from 5,000 to 10 to 20,000 stalker calves out on grass. Our large operators, they are definitely going to implant those calves when they're on grass. Feed yards that own cattle, that grow cattle, own the cattle and have them out on grass before they enter the feed yard, all of those feed yards will implant those cattle because they know the net return and the extra gain they're going to get on that grass, which is much cheaper, a cheaper source of gain than a high-dollar feedlot ration. And so they see the benefit of that. And I think producers, the awareness is increasing, and I think the technology is becoming more widely adopted. And so I think that will continue to increase in the United States in the future.
Okay, awesome. I think that's all the questions that we've got. And I do believe Billy Hall with Chapel is on the line. And I did want to ask, Billy, I don't believe that this group of calves was implanted. Is that correct?
No, I'm pretty sure they have got an implant in the feed yard, yes. They'll actually get two. When we ultrasound is when they'll get their second.
Okay, well, I was wrong. Good to know. Okay, I think that's all the questions we've got for you, Doug. You're welcome to stay on. Billy's going to give us a quick update from the feed yard, but we thank you so much for your time, for jumping in and helping us in terms of our webinar.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a great night. Okay, Billy, I'll turn it over to you. I know there's a quick update that you guys have got to give to our participants.
Yep. Thank you very much. All the cattle, I hope I'm traveling and I'm on my speakerphone in my car, and I hope I don't hit a bad service area. But anyway, all the cattle are doing very well. Here before too long, we'll be ultrasounding the cattle and taking weights, and we'll be getting that data put together probably somewhere in the next, I'd say 40, 45 days. So everything's right along on schedule. So this week in the market, for risk management, we've been trying to protect the downside price risk in the calves. And this last week we had an opportunity and we purchased 108 June live cattle puts. And the premiums that we paid for those, which is basically like buying an insurance policy. And again, I'm traveling. I don't have everything right in front of me. But I think that position, those puts cost $3.45, which is based on 40,000-pound contracts, and we purchased two of those. And then later in the week, we had an opportunity to sell a put. I think it was the $98 put, which gives us a net cost of a little over $2 in the long put side, or the 108 strike price. And the goal in there to finish up financing that, we're hoping to get a pretty good rally in here with what the cash market and the futures are doing, and then we'll have an opportunity to where we'll sell a call, and then that should pretty much have that position placed into what I call a three-way, and we'll have very little expense in that and really good protection. So.
Awesome. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask if anybody had any questions. Y'all feel free to chat or ask him. But feel free to go ahead.
Any questions?
Not that I'm seeing.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, basically, the 108 strike price would be the covering the bottom side risk. So that would be the minimal pricing of the cattle, less the cost of the position. And so again, basically that put option that we purchased was basically like buying an insurance policy. The reason we used the options at this time instead of the futures is this last week we've had the cash market anywhere from 19 or 20 up to 25, 26, 27. We think that the cash market is going to stay premium to the futures, giving us a positive basis, which is a really good position. And so we want to leave the top side open to have all the upside potential that we can. So the only thing we'll have to do when we get the ultrasound data in and we know the exact marketing dates and the ship dates of the cattle is those put options for June will expire the first week in June. So if we have some cattle in there that are in the end of June or somewhere in there, we'll have to look at how many of those cattle that'll be, and we'll have to roll to a short-dated July option if we want to have some coverage. But anyway, I wished I had my stuff in front of me and I could give you the exact numbers, but that's pretty close. So.
Awesome. Well, we just wanted to kind of give you guys this update to let you know that the folks at Chapel are actively working on your steers and trying to do what's best for your steers and for you guys' future. And so once again, as always, we cannot thank the staff and those at Chapel enough for absolutely bending over backwards for our program. And so any last minute questions, send them over my way. But otherwise, I hope you guys have an excellent night. Thank you so much for Billy jumping on here at the last minute and giving us an update. And, of course, thank you for keeping our kids' steers at the top of your mind.
So have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Billy. Good night, everybody.